Imagine that one day you wake up in a perfectly ordinary city. Everything is familiar, everything is predictable, until suddenly the ground begins to tremble beneath your feet and the streets start to flood with slowly rising water. No one believes a disaster could happen, but it is already unfolding right before everyone's eyes. You become an involuntary witness to the last day of Atlantis, a city that was certain of its own eternity and failed to notice how it perished under the weight of its own arrogance and bureaucracy. But before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments which city you're watching from and what time it is there. I'm always curious to see who's joined us. Now, get comfortable. We're starting. You wake up to another completely ordinary morning on Atlantis, a city so perfectly organized that not even the cats bother to chase the mice outside the designated hunting hours. The sun, right on schedule, rises over the eastern promontory with the enthusiasm of a clerk starting his 59th year in the public registry office. The air smells faintly of salt, algae, and that odd metallic tang which the city water supply always has, no matter how many times the council commissions a new purification ritual. You live on the 4th Street of the 3rd District in the northwestern quadrant, which is neither notable nor unremarkable. Like everyone else, you rise at the customary time and spend a quarter of an hour debating whether to eat a barley cake or the day-old fish from last night's feast. You decide on the cake. There is, after all, little reason to take unnecessary risks. Atlantis, as you are keenly aware, prides itself on being the center of civilization, the envy of all nations, the shining example of order, discipline, and irrigation systems. The city planners have divided everything into neat blocks. The priests regulate the tides with complicated chants and predictable hand gestures, and the artisans have invented at least 4 different methods of making a perfectly symmetrical urn. You would call it a golden age if gold was not so abundant here that it is considered gauche to mention it in polite company. As you step out into the street, the city comes alive with 1,000 minor routines. Vendors open their stalls precisely at the bell, offering the same fruits in the same baskets at the same prices as yesterday. Bureaucrats scurry past you, clutching armfuls of stone tablets inscribed with regulations about seagull excrement on public statues. In the central plaza, a group of senior citizens is already engaged in a heated debate about the optimal frequency for cleaning the aqueduct filters. You make your way toward the docks, where nothing ever changes. The sea is calm, the ships are docked in perfectly straight lines, and the harbor master is shouting at a fisherman for mooring half a cubit out of alignment. There is an almost religious reverence for routine here, and the only thing that ever threatens the city's order is the occasional merchant from the mainland who invariably finds himself lost before the second intersection. Yet, for all the talk of greatness, you notice that Atlantis is not nearly as famous as its inhabitants suppose. Foreign traders seem to think of it as a distant, slightly eccentric outpost. Travelers from other lands rarely stay long enough to appreciate the subtleties of the local cuisine, which, to be fair, is mostly variations on boiled grains and something called fish surprise. The City Council has recently commissioned a statue to global admiration, but it remains unfinished as the sculptor cannot decide what universal admiration looks like. Throughout the morning, you witness the full panorama of Atlantean society. The priests, clothed in starched linen and too many amulets, parade to the temple to debate the finer points of sacrificial scheduling. Artisans argue over the merits of geometric versus floral patterns on door frames. The council meets to ratify a new law about umbrella sizes for civic parades, a debate which takes 3 hours and involves 17 subcommittees. You try to find something interesting in the city's news tablets, but discover that the lead story is about the new standard for measuring olive oil purity. The second story concerns the ongoing project to pave the Fifth Street with imported marble, which is now in its second decade due to a disagreement over color shades. Around midday, you notice a peculiar stillness in the air. The wind, which usually brings a comforting coolness from the sea, now carries an odd humidity. Some older residents mutter about the time, years ago, when the western quarter was briefly flooded after a seawall repair went unfinished. They say the water smelled like prophecy. You wonder if this is just an old wives' tale told to frighten children and bureaucrats alike. You spend your afternoon in the market, idly watching as people haggle over onions and discuss the coming festival of ores. A few superstitious types consult the local soothsayer, who tells them that the stars are restless. Nobody pays much attention. The stars are always restless, especially around tax season. Back at your home, you pause to gaze at the city skyline. The grand domes and towers glimmer in the afternoon light. The canals shimmer between perfectly aligned terraces, and the bridges seem to defy both nature and practicality. There is beauty here, yes, but it is the beauty of a city that believes in its own perfection just a bit too much. As evening falls, you notice the water in the canals is ever so slightly higher than usual, lapping at the lowest steps. The ferryman assures you it is only the usual spring tides. Someone suggests that the council might commission another ritual just in case, but the priest in charge of rituals is away, attending a conference on the mainland. You retire for the night with the city still humming with the self-satisfaction of a place convinced that nothing truly bad could ever happen to it. You close your eyes to the distant sound of laughter, the clink of amphorae, and the low, rhythmic chant of the night watch. Atlantis sleeps, content in its routines, and you sleep too, only vaguely aware that, somewhere out beyond the horizon, the waves have begun to move in ways that are anything but routine. The next morning, you awake to a city much the same as it ever was, which is to say, thoroughly preoccupied with itself and its various internal mechanisms. However, today, something feels just slightly off. At first, you assume it is simply your own mind searching for novelty where there is none, But as you make your way through the familiar grid of streets, you notice a subtle trembling beneath your feet. The stones themselves, so carefully arranged by generations of planners, seem to pulse ever so slightly, like a city with a nervous tick. You are not the only one who notices. A baker, long regarded as the most sensible man in your quarter, pauses in his kneading and mutters something about the ground acting like it's had too much barley wine. His apprentice laughs and makes a joke about dancing gods. Others in the market look at one another, eyebrows raised. But in Atlantis, strange things are always discussed with the gravity of a library debate and the urgency of a tortoise race. Within an hour, the Council of Atlanteans convenes an emergency session. You, having nothing better to do, make your way to the public gallery. The chamber is full of noise, the murmur of officials, the shuffling of feet, the ceremonial banging of mallets. A subcommittee forms almost immediately to decide if this is a minor irregularity or a potential inconvenience. There are lengthy recitations of the protocols for soil disturbances and a spirited argument about whether earthquakes count as civic holidays. An old priest from the Temple of the Tides stands and intones that this is merely the result of poorly performed rites at last week's harvest festival. Someone else blames the merchant guild for importing shoddy stones from a neighboring island. A particularly vocal official suggests commissioning a new anthem to raise spirits. The debate grows tiresome and, as usual, ends with a motion to study the matter further, pending formation of a special investigative panel. Meanwhile, you wander outside, only to find that the city's cats have abandoned their usual sunbathing spots. A flock of seabirds wheels overhead, crying out in odd, harsh notes. The city's famed turtles are nowhere to be seen, having apparently retreated into the underbrush at the edge of the ceremonial gardens. It is all, you think, a bit unsettling, but hardly reason for panic. A few citizens, never ones to miss an opportunity for ceremony, organize a ritual consultation with the oracles. You observe as the high oracle arrives, resplendent in robes embroidered with silver thread and weighed down by what must be at least 12 kilograms of amulets. After a prolonged and entirely unconvincing trance, she declares that the future is clouded by aquatic uncertainties. No one is quite sure what this means, but a festival is scheduled in her honor anyway. By midday, the unusual trembling intensifies for a brief moment, causing a minor panic in the East Market. A cart loaded with pomegranates overturns, leading to fierce debates about whether spilled fruit constitutes an ill omen or simply an inconvenience for street cleaners. You watch as the elders form another committee, this one tasked with determining whether insurance claims may be filed for acts of inexplicable nature. Still, there is little real concern. Life continues, albeit with a certain undercurrent of nervous humor. The city's famous philosophers, sensing an opportunity for notoriety, hold a public disputation in the square. One maintains that the tremors are the Earth's way of reminding mortals of their insignificance. Another, less grandiose, blames excessive rainfall last autumn. A third, who is always at odds with the others, posits that the city is suffering from what he calls architectural ennui. It is in this environment of gentle skepticism and dry wit that you attend a dinner party hosted by your neighbor, an official in the Department of Urban Stability. The conversation is lively, but always circles back to the tremors. Someone mentions that their grandmother's garden pond has developed bubbles. Another swears that their dog refuses to cross the main bridge. The official tries to reassure everyone with statistics about the structural integrity of Atlantean stonework, but his argument is undermined when a decorative pillar in the dining room rattles of its own accord. The next day dawns with a heavy sky, low and gray, pressing down on the city like the hand of an irritable god. You walk along the canals and note that the water is murky, a sickly shade of green, and rising higher than usual. The ferrymen, always a reliable source of doom-laden gossip, exchange worried glances and claim that the tides have been misbehaving. You hear that in the southern district, cracks have appeared in the marble tiles of the central baths. The bathers, ever practical, have simply avoided the deepest pools and taken up swimming in shallower ones. It becomes clear, even to the most oblivious, that something unusual is happening. The council commissions a formal investigation. You read the public announcement, carefully engraved on a slab and placed outside the temple gates. It outlines the following steps. 1. Consultation of all available omens. 2. Survey of public infrastructure for possible damage. 3. Issuance of commemorative tokens to all residents, just in case. There is also a lengthy appendix on the proper procedure for reporting water stains. Meanwhile, in the temples, the priests perform purification rites with increasing frequency and decreasing enthusiasm. The air fills with incense, prayers, and the faint sound of snoring from bored acolytes. The rituals, once an occasion for citywide participation, now seem like a hollow echo of themselves, carried out more from habit than faith. At sunset, you stand atop one of the city's countless terraces and look out over the rooftops. A fog creeps in from the sea, blurring the line between land and water. The city lights glimmer uncertainly, reflected in surfaces that seem less solid than they were just days ago. You sense, for the first time, a genuine anxiety in the air, though it is quickly masked by jokes about the latest festival, the price of onions, and the merits of various types of umbrellas. Yet, despite everything, there is still a powerful inertia at work in Atlantis. The city's routines continue, undaunted by the oddities piling up at their margins. You return home, stepping carefully over a new crack in your doorstep, and prepare for sleep as the city's night watch passes by, singing the same song they have sung every night for the past century. You cannot help but think, as you drift off, that all of this might be leading somewhere. The feeling is as faint as the tremor beneath your mattress and as easy to ignore. After all, you tell yourself, Nothing truly extraordinary ever happens in Atlantis. Not until it does. You awake on the third day to a city barely aware that it is on the brink. As usual, you go through your routines, brushing the sleep from your eyes, listening to the familiar morning chorus, the measured calls of the city criers, the shuffle of neighbors heading to the bakery, the far off hammering of a builder who insists every day is suitable for renovations. Yet behind this well oiled facade, the world is changing in ways that are difficult to ignore, unless you are an Atlantean, in which case you ignore them out of principle. The sky is heavy and colorless, filled with a thick mist that refuses to disperse even as the sun climbs higher. By late morning, it is obvious that the city is being enveloped by a fog not seen in living memory. Your neighbor claims the fog is good for the complexion. His wife says it is bad for the laundry. The council issues a statement declaring atmospheric opacity to be beneficial for crop yields. A minor celebration is scheduled for the following week. As the hours pass, you notice the water in the canals creeping higher. It starts subtly. The bottom steps of the plaza's grand stairway are submerged, the sound of gentle lapping now a constant background to the city's conversations. The market, usually bustling, is quieter than normal. Vendors have set up their stalls further inland. People joke about fish at your doorstep and invent new recipes for soup involving rainwater, barley, and wishful thinking. The city's scholars, ever eager to display their learning, gather at the agora to debate the cause of these events. You watch as one group, dressed in blue robes, blames a rare alignment of celestial bodies. Another, in purple, blames a recent shortage of imported incense, which they claim has thrown the city's spiritual equilibrium out of balance. A third group, notably less well dressed, blames the council for not scheduling enough festivals. There is a lengthy treatise about the historical fluctuations of water levels, which is read aloud at great length to universal yawns. As afternoon fades, the tension grows more obvious. The children, usually noisy and impossible to herd, are subdued, watching the adults with wide eyes. The older citizens recall, with a seriousness usually reserved for tax disputes, stories of the Great Soggy Year decades ago, when flooding made it impossible to harvest figs. The more nervous families have begun moving valuables, mostly family records, gold jewelry, and the remains of last year's dried fish up to the attics. But for every person who frets, there are two who remain convinced that Atlantis is immune to real misfortune. At a meeting in the city's central square, a government official stands on a crate and recites from memory the long history of successful engineering projects undertaken by the city, the construction of the seawalls, the ingenious system of locks and canals, the legendary irrigation schemes. He finishes by reminding everyone that no water, not even from the angriest sea, has ever breached the central plaza. The speech is well received, though somewhat undermined, when a minor official slips on the newly wet stones and falls into a puddle. By early evening, The canals are overflowing. Water spills into the side streets, carrying with it bits of debris, broken reeds, abandoned sandals, the odd crate of onions. You watch as the citizens, still unwilling to believe the evidence of their eyes, continue with their usual routines. The bakers attempt to sell soggy bread. The marketeers try to keep their vegetables dry, using elaborate arrangements of palm fronds and philosophical optimism. The council issues another proclamation. Citizens are encouraged to remain calm and refrain from unnecessary speculation. You wander toward the city square, where a crowd has gathered to discuss next steps. It is a lively assembly, full of conflicting opinions and theatrical gestures. A delegation from the Temple of the Sun insists on performing a purification rite. A group of merchants proposes building an emergency wall using amphorae of surplus olive oil. A philosopher suggests organizing a poetry contest to distract everyone from their worries. The only consensus is that someone else should be responsible for making any real decisions. As the light fades, you notice that the water is now halfway up the main steps of the plaza. In the distance, the seawall, pride of Atlantean engineering, looks smaller than you remember, its outline blurry through the dense fog. Somewhere nearby, a group of children floats a makeshift raft made from fruit crates, laughing as they paddle through what used to be the street. The air grows thick and humid, and the city takes on a strange hush, as if waiting for something it cannot name. The council meets one last time for the day, debating the latest reports. Some call for evacuation, but most dismiss the idea as unnecessary. You overhear two officials arguing about whether evacuation is even a word Atlanteans should use, given their proud history of resilience. No decision is reached. The meeting dissolves in a welter of procedural disputes and complaints about the quality of the official ink. You find yourself on the city's main square as night falls. People mill about, discussing the news in low, uncertain voices. Some exchange nervous jokes. Others gather around the high steps of the temple, waiting for the priests to perform another round of rituals. The city's musicians attempt to lighten the mood with a melancholy song, but the notes echo strangely off the waterlogged buildings. As you stand there, ankle deep in cold water, you cannot shake the feeling that something enormous and unstoppable is approaching. The city, for all its cleverness and pride, is no longer quite in control of its fate. For the first time in memory, Atlantis feels vulnerable, small, almost, in the face of the rising sea. And you, standing amidst the crowd, begin to wonder what tomorrow will bring and whether the city's legendary luck will hold for one more night. Morning in Atlantis arrives not so much with a sunrise as with the gradual realization that the city is more water than land. You wake to the sound of hurried footsteps outside and the unmistakable slap of oars against makeshift rafts. Through your window, the familiar view of tiled rooftops and orderly boulevards has been replaced by a shifting landscape of flooded streets, bobbing crates, and flustered neighbors hauling household treasures to higher ground. Your own dwelling, once three solid floors of predictability, now offers only a single dry room on the top level. The rest is submerged, a new domain for curious fish and, presumably, the city's less successful rats. Like everyone else, you move through your morning with a kind of resigned formality, as if mere routine might halt the encroaching tide. You dress with care, choosing your least absorbent tunic, and pack a satchel with bread, a ceremonial spoon, and the minutes from last month's neighborhood committee meeting, because it would be unthinkable to face disaster without documentation. You step outside, navigating a footbridge constructed from overturned tables, and join your neighbors on what remains of the plaza. The city, always so orderly, has descended into an elaborate chaos. The baker's shop is half submerged, yet he still insists on selling soggy loaves to anyone who floats past. The fishmonger's stand, usually fragrant and bustling, now functions as a pier for those wishing to tie up their rafts. A group of local officials, knee-deep in water, attempt to organize a bucket brigade, but quickly become distracted by a debate over whether buckets or amphorae are more in keeping with municipal guidelines. Amidst this scene of slow-moving catastrophe, the most remarkable thing is the Atlantean commitment to procedure. Even as the water rises, the city's scribes are hard at work, recording damages in precise detail, issuing temporary permits for raft construction, and filing reports on the status of decorative fountains now several meters below the waterline. The council convenes its morning meeting on the steps of the great temple, the only venue still reliably above sea level. The high priest begins with an invocation to the gods of stability and dryness, followed by a lengthy report from the chief auditor of public works, who suggests that the flooding is within acceptable seasonal variation if viewed from a sufficiently optimistic angle. As noon approaches, the crisis deepens. The water, once a creeping nuisance, is now an inescapable reality. You watch as citizens attempt increasingly desperate and inventive strategies to save possessions. A philosopher ferries his entire library, tablet by tablet, to the highest rooftop. A merchant constructs a barricade from his surplus of unsold garden statues. A group of children organize a flotilla of wooden trays, declaring themselves the official Atlantean Navy and issuing fines to passing adults for improper rowing technique. Despite these efforts, the city is plainly losing its battle. Buildings tilt at odd angles, walls crumble with alarming regularity, and even the grandest monuments now serve as roosts for flocks of bewildered gulls. You see a crowd gathered at the entrance to the central archives, arguing about the best method to waterproof clay tablets. The prevailing solution is to wrap them in goat skins and hope for divine intervention. The atmosphere is a mixture of farce and tragedy. Old feuds resurface as neighbors bicker over whose sandbags are blocking whose doorways. A group of amateur engineers attempts to build a dam out of woven baskets, an effort both heroic and hopeless. Through it all, the city's heralds continue their rounds, reading updates from the council with voices growing hoarse and slightly hysterical. Citizens are reminded to observe proper etiquette while evacuating. All complaints regarding water depth should be submitted in triplicate. By late afternoon, panic begins to set in, though Atlanteans express it mainly through pointed sarcasm and marathon length arguments. A public debate breaks out on the steps of the temple. Is the flooding the fault of the city's hydraulic engineers, the neglectful gods, or perhaps that new brand of olive oil nobody likes? The baker claims it is because of imported yeast. The high priest blames the lack of recent offerings. A group of visiting philosophers shrugs and suggests it is the natural order of things, then asks if there is any wine left. You witness acts of small heroism and large absurdity. One family forms a human chain to rescue a prized statue of a sea cow. Another couple attempts to salvage their marriage by blaming the flood on each other. The city's leading mathematician calculates the rate of water rise to 3 decimal places, then falls silent when he realizes the answer. As dusk falls, you find yourself clinging to a fragment of the central bridge, watching as more of Atlantis disappears beneath the waves. The city's musicians play a dirge on the temple steps, the melancholy notes floating out across the water, mingling with the splash of oars and the occasional burst of nervous laughter. The council, after hours of inconclusive debate, issues a final proclamation. Atlantis shall maintain dignity in all circumstances. Citizens are encouraged to keep a record of events for posterity, should posterity ever reappear. Darkness settles in, bringing with it a silence broken only by the soft, relentless sound of water rising. You are soaked, exhausted, and surrounded by the scattered relics of a city that once prided itself on invincibility. For the first time, you sense that the end is not a possibility, but an inevitability, a slow, bureaucratic undoing, catalogued in triplicate and witnessed by all. And so, with a grim sort of patience, you wait to see which will vanish first, the last bit of dry land, or the stubborn optimism that made Atlantis what it was. You awaken in the gray light of dawn, or perhaps it is only the thinning mist, to find Atlantis has all but vanished. The city, once a grid of marble, markets, and interminable public debates, is now a silent sprawl beneath the waves. Your home is gone, the plaza is gone. Even the baker's cheerful curses have faded, replaced by the slow, ceaseless lapping of water against the few surviving stones. You perch on a broken column, the last remnant of the temple's portico, and take in what remains. A sea stretching in every direction, calm and unremarkable, as if nothing had ever existed here at all. Around you, the other survivors are few and scattered, each isolated on their own shrinking islands of debris. Some sit in stunned silence, clutching whatever relics they manage to save: an urn, a dog-eared record of last year's tax payments, a ceremonial ladle. A merchant, ever practical, tries to tally the inventory of his sunken shop, counting off items on his fingers before giving up and tossing the list into the water. Above, gulls circle in search of anything edible, their cries strangely cheerful in the unnatural stillness. You look down through the clear surface of the water and see shadows where streets once lay, columns reaching up like fingers, the pale outlines of mosaics now just blurred smudges beneath the waves. Here and there you catch a glimmer, perhaps a coin, perhaps a lost earring, perhaps only a trick of the sun on rippling water. It occurs to you, as you watch, that Atlantis was never as grand as it claimed, but its fall is no less spectacular for that. The silence settles heavily. You think of the city's endless meetings, the rituals, the debates about bridge width and festival dates, the precise number of steps in each public staircase. How carefully the council had planned for every conceivable emergency, except this one. There are no more committees, no more proclamations, no more scribes to record water levels in triplicate. All that remains is the great, indifferent sea, swallowing centuries of careful record keeping in a matter of hours. Still, true to your upbringing, you feel compelled to document. You tear a strip from your sleeve, dip it in what little ink remains, and attempt to record a summary. On this day, the city of Atlantis, after much deliberation, has been thoroughly submerged. You consider adding a line about the probable causes, but realize there is no one left to argue over them. You reflect that, in time, even this account will wash away, perhaps to be found by a curious fish or a bemused archaeologist centuries from now. The others are busy with their own post catastrophic rituals. The priest, deprived of his congregation, intones a prayer to the gods of memory and forgetting. The mathematician attempts to recalculate the city's dimensions, but cannot decide where the boundaries now lie. One of the city's poets recites verses about loss and water, his voice carrying oddly in the vast, empty air. You imagine the scholars of the future, bent over fragments of pottery and trying to piece together what life here must have been. You wonder if they will get it right. Will they recognize the daily routines, the committees, the petty quarrels? Will they debate the significance of the Great Flood, or will they focus, as Atlanteans did, on the finer points of building codes and ceremonial spoon usage? The day passes slowly. The sun climbs higher, glinting off the water, revealing yet more of the city's submerged remains. The survivors, growing fewer by the hour, drift apart on makeshift rafts, or else huddle in silence. Some cling to hope, scanning the horizon for rescue. Others let themselves drift into memory, recounting the glories of a city that is no more. You find yourself neither hopeful nor despairing, merely a witness, recording the slow dissolution of what was once the center of the world. As evening falls, the wind picks up, and you realize the waters have risen once more. The last visible column slips beneath the surface, leaving you afloat on a piece of driftwood, your feet trailing in the cold sea. You look back, searching for anything familiar, but find only the unbroken line of the horizon and the faintest echo of voices lost to the waves. For a moment, you recall the stories that were told in Atlantis about the power of the sea, the danger of pride, the certainty of change. You remember the counselor's endless optimism, the priest's comforting rituals, the way the city always seemed just on the verge of figuring itself out. Now, it is all memory, scattered and fading, as insubstantial as the last line in a soggy ledger. The night comes down quietly, with no fanfare, no final decree, no closing anthem. There is only you, floating in the silence, bearing witness to an ending so slow and thorough that it almost feels like sleep. The world continues as it always has, indifferent, patient, endlessly recording and erasing. And you, last chronicler of Atlantis, finally let go of the last thread of land and let yourself drift, trusting that someday, someone, somewhere will find the remains and wonder at the strange, beautiful, and ultimately forgettable story that was Atlantis.